The courthouse was alive with a strange, thrumming energy, as though each person crammed into the wooden benches carried their own secret tension. At the center of it all, presiding over the commotion, sat Judge Lynn Rathburn, her brow creased in a curious blend of skepticism and anticipation. She studied the man at the podium with a gaze so piercing it could slice through steel. He wasn't young. In fact, he looked well into his 40s, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair and a weary determination etched into the lines of his face. Everyone called him Marcus Davis, but in this moment, he was something of an enigma, a private citizen daring to stand against a wall of attorneys and powerful stakeholders. A rustle passed through the crowd when Marcus cleared his throat. His broad shoulders tensed, and his gaze swept over the assembled faces. He did not look like a man who reveled in the spotlight. The sweat beating at his temple betrayed that. Still, there was a certain steadiness in his voice, the kind that made the bailiff lean forward just a fraction more than usual. The reporters stationed at the back, cameras poised, seemed riveted, waiting to see what might burst from his lip. Judge Rathburn folded her hands and offered a thin smile. "Mr. Davis," she said with deliberate calm, "am I to understand correctly that you, a private accountant from a small Midwest town, intend to argue a constitutional matter in my courtroom without formal counsel?" A nervous chuckle echoed from a few onlookers, but Marcus, gripping the edges of the podium with both hands, refused to flinch. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied evenly. "I believe the system has harmed not just one individual but countless lives. Someone has to bring this into the light." His words, though quiet, ignited murmurs, as though a match had been thrown onto a bed of dry leaves. Even Judge Rathburn allowed a single eyebrow to arc upward. "You're accusing the largest chain of private hospitals in the region, along with their insurance affiliates, of systemic negligence, discrimination, and what you describe as orchestrated denial of critical care," she said, scanning a paper on her desk. "That's quite the undertaking." A flicker of something fierce ignited in Marcus's eyes. "Yes, Your Honor, it's exactly what I'm doing." An audible wave rippled through the crowd. A few journalists scribbled hastily in their notebooks. Opposite the bench, a team of suits, representatives of Broadwell Medical Group, exchanged looks of irritation. One of them, a woman in a tailored navy blue blazer named Irene Walker, smoothed down a stack of documents and prepared to speak. Her posture radiated the kind of confidence that comes from many years of winning major cases. Before she could interject, the judge tapped her gavel lightly. "We'll proceed, Mr. Davis. However, do be mindful that this court does not appreciate theatrics. If you continue, be prepared to offer more than conjecture." A faint tremor ran through Marcus's fingers, but the strength in his voice did not falter. "Understood," he said. The exchange might have seemed unremarkable at first glance, just another day in a crowded courtroom. Yet something in the charged air signaled that events were in motion which could impact far more than the handful of people present. Nobody realized just how massive the stakes would become, or how many lives would be forever changed. As men and women in the gallery leaned forward, straining to hear every syllable, Marcus let his mind wander back to the beginning, to the moment that thrust him into this legal maelstrom he'd never sought. Months earlier, he was merely an unassuming accountant in the quiet town of Lakewood. He had turned 45 that summer, a milestone that left him wrestling with the realization that time was ticking by faster than he cared to admit. His days were spent poring over ledgers and spreadsheets, concluding each afternoon with a visit to his mother, Gloria, who resided in a local nursing home. It was a simple, predictable existence. He liked it that way. Life had never taught him to yearn for spotlights or drama. All that changed the day he discovered his mother had been denied a crucial heart procedure by her insurance, and by extension, the hospital that refused to accept her as a patient. Gloria's condition had been deteriorating, and every day her breathing grew more labored. Yet every call Marcus made to the hospital's administration was met with the same rehearsed excuse. The claim was pending, the papers in review, and sometimes he was simply told that her coverage didn't meet the hospital's requirements for elective procedures. Elective? A heart procedure that determined whether she lived another year or not was hardly a matter of convenience. The disbelief in Marcus's heart hardened into anger, especially when he learned from a sympathetic nurse that dozens of other patients were being turned away under similarly suspicious pretenses. Some had terminal diagnoses, others needed life-saving treatments. The hospital, Broadwell Medical, seemed to carry out a system that put profit calculations ahead of human lives. Or, so the nurse whispered, fear lighting her eyes, as if merely sharing that tidbit could risk her job. Fanned by love for his mother and a hatred for injustice, Marcus embarked on a personal investigation. He was, after all, methodical by nature, an accountant trained to see patterns in the data. Late nights were spent poring over publicly available financial statements, policy documents, and the labyrinth of insurance guidelines. A puzzle emerged, piece by piece, pointing to something far bigger than his mother's single case. He saw a suspicious pattern. High-risk patients with moderate insurance were turned away. Patients with premium coverage got immediate acceptance. Something inside him snapped. The more he peeled back the layers, the more outraged he became. He confided in an old friend, Martin, an attorney who specialized in business law. Martin's hair was graying at the temples, and he wore a perpetual air of exasperation with the world. At first, Martin told Marcus he was chasing ghosts, but when Marcus showed him the data, numbers that correlated with a near-perfect pattern of denial for at-risk patients lacking certain top-tier insurance ailments, Martin's skepticism evaporated. "God help me," Martin murmured, sifting through the evidence. "This looks planned." That was the word that made Marcus's blood run cold. Planned. What kind of system meticulously strategized ways to turn away sick people, manipulating coverage loopholes so no single rule was broken, but ensuring certain demographics were effectively locked out of care? His mother's health worsened, fueling his determination. He wanted to sue, to fight, to do something, but Martin insisted that it would require a team of lawyers and an avalanche of money. Even then, the chance of success was slim. "Broadwell is huge, and they have a legal army," Martin warned. "I'd help you if I could, but my firm is already entangled in corporate conflicts. I can't lead the charge." Marcus spent weeks knocking on the doors of law firms. Many offered polite sympathy and pointed out how unstoppable Broadwell Medical Group was. A few took a cursory glance at the evidence but insisted on a gargantuan retainer. In short, no one was willing to champion his cause. That left him with a choice: give up and watch his mother fade, or press on alone. His sense of justice and love for Gloria refused to let him surrender, so, quietly, he filed the suit in his own name. When he told his mother, whose eyes had dimmed with fatigue, she simply smiled. "You've always stood up for me," she whispered, placing a frail hand over his. "Don't let them win, Marcus." That small statement became his life's mission. He devoured every book he could find on procedural law, read up on medical case precedents, and devoured legal articles until dawn each day. It was no guarantee of success, and he knew it, but he also sensed that an undeniable moral impetus was fueling him. At night, he wrestled with nightmares of losing his mother, of losing everything. Yet in the morning, he always woke with renewed fire in his veins. So here he was, in front of Judge Rathburn, facing off against a legion of corporate attorneys. Irene Walker, the formidable counsel for Broadwell, was rumored to have never lost a major lawsuit. And yet there Marcus stood, voice reverberating across the silent courtroom as he told the judge that this problem was bigger than a single insurance claim. "It's about an entire flawed system," he said, in the measured tone of a man who understood the gravity of what he was unleashing. Judge Rathburn, unimpressed or perhaps guarded, leaned forward. "You keep asserting that this goes beyond your mother's case, Mr. Davis. Do you have anything more substantial than speculation to back that claim?" Marcus was about to respond when the doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open. A court clerk hustled in, face flushed with worry. She passed a folded note to the judge, who scanned it, her expression intensifying. Everyone remain seated, the judge announced. I've been informed there's an urgent matter pertaining to this hearing. An anxious hush fell, so strong that you could almost feel the air shift. In the midst of the tension, Marcus's heart pounded violently. He braced for some new obstacle. He was used to them by now. Rejections, suspicious phone calls, even subtle threats. But nothing prepared him for the judge's stern pronouncement. We're going to adjourn until I've reviewed this. Apparently, a federal agency has shown interest in this case. A collective gasp radiated through the audience. Federal agency? Why? And which one? Marcus's mind spun. Around him, reporters started scribbling faster, and the attorneys on Broadwell's side burst into hushed but frantic discussion. Irene's composure never faltered, but her lips pressed into a thin line. She clearly didn't welcome this development. That night, Marcus found himself in the old living room of his childhood home, sitting with his Uncle Travis, who was visiting to check on Gloria. The place smelled faintly of musty books and the pot roast Travis had brought over. Marcus tried to recount the day's events, but his words felt hollow. It's spiraling, he murmured, rubbing the back of his neck. I never dreamed it would blow up like this. Travis, a retired teacher whose wisdom Marcus deeply respected, offered a gentle nod. Remember, sometimes when you seek justice, you open doors you never knew existed. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Or so Dr. King said. Maybe you're living that truth right now. The words comforted him more than he'd admit. He sat there, letting them resonate, wishing he could see the shape of the fight to come. Everything accelerated the next day. Marcus received a call from a woman identifying herself as Jacqueline Foreman, an investigator with the Department of Health and Human Services. We've been following rumors of systematic coverage denial, Foreman said in a clipped, no-nonsense voice. We see your lawsuit as interesting. We'd like to speak with you. Marcus's adrenaline soared. He hesitated before asking, Are you investigating Broadwell specifically? A pause followed, pregnant with caution. I can't divulge details, but yes, let's say they're one of our concerns. We'll be in touch. He hung up, staring at the phone as though it had suddenly burst into flames. He was an accountant, not a vigilante. How on earth had he ended up the potential linchpin in a federal investigation? 3 days later, Foreman appeared in Lakewood unannounced. She was in her early 50s with a neat, silver-streaked bun and a handshake that felt like iron. Marcus took her to a modest diner near the courthouse, hoping to avoid watchers. He had grown paranoid of prying eyes, particularly those belonging to Broadwell's well-paid legal team or private investigators. Over black coffee and barely touched sandwiches, Foreman cut straight to the point. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of internal memos from various hospital administrators. The language was coded, but clearly indicated that certain categories of patients were to be deferred or advised to seek alternative care if coverage thresholds were not met. The more Marcus read, the more nauseous he felt. This is just the tip of the iceberg, Foreman said grimly. We believe it's a widespread practice across multiple states. Your lawsuit might be the perfect trigger to expose it. Marcus felt torn between vindication and raw terror. He cradled the coffee cup in both hands to stop them from trembling. They'll come for me, he said under his breath. They've got unlimited resources to do that. Foreman reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. Yes, they might. The question is, do you still want to move forward knowing we'll be digging deeper? We can't guarantee your safety or that your mother's care won't be jeopardized further. His stomach clenched. For a fleeting second, he saw his mother's weakened smile. He heard her voice. Don't let them win, Marcus. Slowly he looked up. If I don't do it, who will? She gave a solemn nod. Then we stand together on this. A new fear kept him awake that night, a fear far more piercing than any frustration he'd felt before. It was the knowledge that he was stepping into a battlefield with giants who had everything to lose, but there was no turning back. The next court hearing took on a different tone. Broadwell's attorneys seemed better prepared, more aggressive. Irene Walker turned her full attention on Marcus, firing a volley of pointed questions about his credentials, his motivations, and whether he was simply out for a payday. The insinuations were cutting, and the tension escalated when she calmly declared, "This entire fiasco is orchestrated by someone seeking personal gain. I intend to prove that you, Mr. Davis, are nothing more than an alarmist trying to exploit the media." Marcus felt a flush of anger burn beneath his collar. He leveled her with a steady gaze. "My only aim," he said, his voice taut, "is to save lives, including my mother's." The hush that fell over the courtroom was intense enough to make the overhead lights buzz in collective silence. Moments later, the doors swung open. This time, a tall, lean figure strode in with a purposeful gait. "Foreman!" She slipped a paper to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. A stir traveled through the gallery as the judge scanned the page. "It appears," Judge Rathburn announced, "we have new evidence from a federal investigation that may pertain directly to Mr. Davis's claims." A swirl of shock and indignation danced across Irene Walker's face. She shot to her feet. "Your Honor, this is inappropriate. We have a right to review anything the government intends to inject into this proceeding." The judge nodded. "And you shall. However, we'll first recess to determine its relevance." Outside in the hallway, Foreman gave Marcus a quiet nod. "They're furious," she whispered. "Good. Let them be. This might be bigger than you realize." He managed a tight smile, his heart pounding. "I figured as much." Weeks crawled by in a haze of depositions, endless documents, and unexpected revelations. Every time Marcus thought he'd found the bottom of this rabbit hole, a new corridor opened, darker than the last. He discovered that one hospital after another had participated in manipulative coverage strategies. Entire communities had been systematically underserved. The patients turned away under the pretense of limited capacity or lack of network coverage. Numbers, which had always been Marcus's closest ally, now tore his conscience apart. For every statistic he unearthed, there was a real human story behind it. Someone who couldn't afford better insurance, someone who lost a loved one for lack of timely care. He also began receiving phone calls at strange hours. At first they were silent, breathing on the line. Then came the messages, a low-voice male. "You think you can play hero? People like you don't survive that game." Click, the line would go dead. Fear twisted inside him like a poisonous vine. He started checking over his shoulder wherever he went. Martin, his lawyer friend, insisted on installing a better security system at Marcus's modest house. Travis left voicemail after voicemail urging him to be careful. More than once, Marcus thought of quitting, especially when he saw the worry in his mother's eyes. But each time, the memory of her labored breathing fueled him to keep going. He could not let them bury the truth. A turning point came when a nurse named Daniela Alvarez stepped forward. She was trembling when she found Marcus outside the courtroom one afternoon. I need to tell you something," she whispered, barely audible, eyes darting as though searching for watchers. Daniela worked in the admissions department at one of Broadwell's hospitals. She clutched a folder to her chest. "I copied some emails. They show how we were instructed to prioritize certain patients and stall others. I can't keep doing this." Marcus's throat constricted. "Daniela, you understand the risk?" She nodded, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "It's the right thing, though. I can't live with myself if I stay silent." She pressed the folder into his hands. "Use them however you can." He wanted to hug her, but she quickly glanced around and fled, leaving him alone, clutching damning evidence that could not only bolster his case, but possibly blow the entire scandal wide open. That night he pored over the emails until dawn, searching for a smoking gun. He found multiple. One exchange read like a manual on how to quietly redirect complex cases to rival facilities to avoid financial liabilities. Another spelled out tactics for screening patients at intake, offering administrative rejections when dealing with coverage shortfalls. The language was chilling. Relief and dread warred within him. This was exactly what he needed, but it also meant the corporation's retaliation would ramp up. Sure enough, within days their legal counsel demanded an emergency hearing to dismiss the entire lawsuit, claiming that Marcus was now in possession of confidential materials obtained illegally, and that the entire proceeding was compromised. Irene Walker's voice practically dripped venom as she addressed the judge. "We have reason to believe the plaintiff has knowingly accepted stolen documents. This alone warrants immediate dismissal, or at the very least an injunction on using such evidence." Marcus stood, hands shaking with anger. These documents expose wrongdoing on a massive scale. Dismissing them because they're confidential would be like ignoring an alarm because it's too loud. A hush settled. Judge Rathburn pressed her lips together. "Let's not be hasty. If these materials indeed reveal a systemic issue, we must weigh the public interest. However, I agree that we need to determine how they were procured." She glanced at Marcus. "Where exactly did you get them?" His chest tightened. He couldn't name Daniela outright. That could ruin her career, or worse, put her in danger. But the truth had to come out. He swallowed. "They were provided by an individual who witnessed unethical practices. They chose to speak out. I won't identify them for their safety." Irene sneered. "This is vigilante behavior and you know it." Marcus stared back. "This is the truth and you know it." The standoff crackled with tension. Eventually, Judge Rathburn ruled that the court would allow the documents but would hold a closed hearing on the matter of their procurement. For now, the case stayed alive, but it was hanging by a thread. One slip and the entire complaint might be thrown out. That evening, Marcus's phone buzzed with a withheld number. He almost let it go to voicemail, but a strange intuition made him pick up. The voice on the other end was female, low and urgent. "Mr. Davis, you don't know me, but I'm an analyst for Broadwell's PR division. I want to help." He stiffened. "How can I be sure?" A soft exhale. "You can't. But you'll want to see what I have. They're about to smear you in the media. Documents, photos, all twisted to discredit you as a con artist. Meet me behind the Lakewood Library at 9 tonight. I'll show you proof." His heart hammered. It was the kind of invitation that led to cautionary tales. Yet the dread that churned in his stomach told him it was real. After calling Martin for a second opinion, Martin strongly advised him not to go alone. Marcus decided to risk it, only with an acquaintance from the local paper watching at a distance. He arrived at the library, nerves on high alert, scanning the shadows until he spotted a slight figure in a hooded coat. In her trembling hand were a few printed pages, half illuminated by a flickering street lamp. She introduced herself only as Althea. With quick, jerky movements she passed him the pages. They showed internal memos discussing an attack plan to paint Marcus as an ex-felon, referencing some old financial error from his early career. In truth, he'd once had an accounting discrepancy that resulted in a formal warning. The plan was to blow it out of proportion, paint him as incompetent and unethical. "They want to break you," Althea hissed, eyes darting, "so you'll drop the suit or lose support from the media." Marcus felt a wave of weary anger. He thanked her, but she vanished into the night without a second glance. Fear and resolve churned in his gut, a volatile combination. He realized that in order to keep going, he needed more allies, more eyes on the wrongdoing, so no hush-up strategy could bury him. He called a friendly local reporter, a middle-aged man named Robert Chang, who had always been sympathetic to the underdog. "Rob, I have something you'll want to see." The next day, an expose ran in the local news site, accompanied by a short TV segment on the evening broadcast. The story hammered at Broadwell's rumored tactics, teased that internal documents would soon be made public, and questioned how many lives had been impacted. The result was immediate uproar. Broadwell's attorneys responded with statements calling the allegations baseless rumor-mongering, but suddenly Marcus wasn't alone. Strangers began reaching out. People who claimed their relatives had died after being turned away, or that they themselves had to beg for critical procedures. Letters flooded the small Lakewood courthouse addressed to him. Most ended with lines like, "Please keep fighting." Emboldened by this outpouring, Marcus met with Foreman from HHS once more, providing her copies of the newly acquired documents. She eyed them with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "We've got enough to justify deeper federal involvement," she murmured. "We'll be joining your case in an official capacity, but be ready. Broadwell will fight like a cornered animal. Sure enough, at the next hearing, Irene Walker stood in front of a jam-packed courtroom and demanded the entire matter be placed under a strict gag order. "We can't allow a media circus to overshadow the facts," she said sternly, glancing at Marcus. "My client's reputation is being unjustly destroyed." Judge Rathburn, who rarely showed emotion, tapped her pen. "The public deserves to know if the allegations are real. However, I share your concern about undue sensationalism. I'm placing certain constraints on media access but not granting a full gag order." Marcus exhaled, relief spiking through him. The fight continued. But that morning, before recess, a tall, broad-shouldered man burst through the doors, his jacket dusty as though he'd driven through the night. He introduced himself as Pierce Lennox, a representative from the state's Attorney General office. The hush that fell was deafening. Even Irene's usual poise cracked. If only for a second. Marcus's spine tingled. Why was the AG's office stepping in now? The possibilities made him uneasy. That day ended in a swirl of rumor and speculation. Everyone suspected the state might be launching its own inquiry, or perhaps, ironically, looking to shut Marcus down to protect local economic interests. Over the following weeks, a thick tension settled over Lakewood like a low-hanging storm cloud. Government investigators, reporters from out of town, and private corporate investigators took up temporary residence in the small motels. The local diner was abuzz with talk about how the big city folks were poking around. One overheard snippet. "They say it's a scandal that could shake up the entire healthcare industry." Marcus felt the momentum building, but along with it came an avalanche of personal stakes. The intimidation tactics grew bolder. Phone calls suggesting he drop the case. "For your family's own good." Ominous letters delivered without a return address, and strangers tailing him on the highway. At one point his front window was shattered late at night, the culprit never found. And yet every new threat only hardened his will, for it confirmed the corporate machine must be truly frightened. Sometimes he whispered the old line from Winston Churchill to himself at bedtime, "Never give in, never, never, never." When the state's AG office filed a motion to review certain aspects of Marcus's lawsuit, tensions soared. Irene Walker seized it as an opportunity to stymie the proceedings. "Until the Attorney General clarifies their involvement, we request a stay of all hearings," she declared to the judge. This has become a jurisdictional nightmare. Marcus's chest tightened. He rose and pleaded that justice delayed was justice denied, especially for patients in dire need. The judge seemed torn, her gaze flicking between him and Walker. Ultimately, she refused to suspend the entire matter, but agreed to a short recess while she consulted the AG's office. Marcus left the courthouse reeling from the possibility that the entire suit might be locked up in bureaucratic limbo. That afternoon, as he was heading to check on his mother, he received a frantic call from Daniela, the nurse who'd risked so much. She breathed into the phone. "They questioned me at the hospital, threatened to fire me if I don't retract my statement." A surge of guilt and anger lanced through him. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I never intended for you to suffer." Her voice shook. "You didn't cause this, they did. I'm not backing down. I just want you to know you're not alone." And with that, she hung up. Marcus sat in his car for a long time, letting her words sink into him like a bomb. You're not alone. The following week was a whirlwind. A hearing date arrived when everyone, federal investigators, the AG's staff, and Broadwell's attorneys, piled into the courthouse. The tension was near electric. News vans lined the street outside, and the small Lakewood courthouse seemed on the verge of bursting. Marcus stood at the podium once again, pulse racing. He could feel a storm of eyes upon him, scanning for a sign of weakness. Judge Rathburn opened the proceedings with an uncharacteristically grave voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "we have multiple parties now with vested interests. The Department of Health and Human Services, the Attorney General's office. The question is whether this court will continue with the original lawsuit or whether external investigations will take precedence." She turned to Marcus. "Mr. Davis, you've created quite the uproar." In the first row, a few people snickered. Irene Walker gave him an icy glare. Yet Marcus squared his shoulders. "Your Honor, all I've ever wanted was proper care for my mother and for everyone similarly situated. If the court hands this off to bureaucrats, it might be years before anything changes. People are suffering now. It was a moment as fragile as spun glass." The judge pursed her lips. Then, as though the atmosphere couldn't crackle any further, the courtroom doors opened one more time. A junior clerk stepped in, balancing a thick file. "This just arrived," she said, breathless. "Documents under seal from a whistleblower in Broadwell's corporate offices. They're addressed to the court and the state's investigative body." A wave of commotion broke across the room. Judge Rathburn hammered her gavel. "Order! Everyone sit down!" She beckoned the clerk forward and examined the file with visible astonishment. Glancing up, she leveled a stare at the attorneys. "Counsel, I suggest you prepare yourselves." In a swirl of heightened emotions, the judge declared a brief adjournment to review the new data. As the crowd filed out, the hush was broken by frantic whispers. Marcus felt faint, overwhelmed by the scope of the revelations. It was as if every time he approached the bottom of this scandal, the ground collapsed to reveal a deeper level of corruption. Outside the courtroom, Foreman cornered him. "I just got off the phone with my contact at the AG's office," she said. "They're hinting the documents confirm collusion at the highest corporate levels. We're talking huge ramifications, maybe even RICO charges if it's proven that the hospital system conspired across state lines." Marcus's breath caught. "RICO? That's meant for organized crime." Foreman nodded grimly. "This is bigger than a few hospital administrators. If these whistleblower files are legitimate, we have a potential multi-state conspiracy to manipulate coverage." He stared at her in numb shock. Everything in him waged war. Part of him wanted to jump for joy at the possibility of exposing wrongdoing, while another part quailed at the magnitude. If Broadwell had resources before, how much more viciously would they fight now? He could hardly wrap his mind around the fact that a typical middle-aged accountant had found himself in the center of one of the biggest healthcare scandals in recent memory. Inside, the reassembled court bristled with impatience. Judge Rathburn returned, her expression tight. She addressed the entire courtroom with a voice that cut through the tension like a blade. "The new evidence is extensive. It indicates orchestrated policies to discriminate in admissions, referencing insurance coverage levels, age, and even geographical location. The revelations implicate several Broadwell executives by name. Given the potential conflict with ongoing federal investigations, this court will proceed, but with caution." She turned a steely gaze onto Marcus. "Mr. Davis, your role here has evolved. This is no longer simply about your mother or your personal lawsuit. You understand the gravity of that?" He nodded mutely, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I do." A swirl of days followed that felt like a fever dream. Foreman's department officially joined the lawsuit as a co-complainant, and attorneys from the AG's office stepped in. The media spotlight glared. Marcus found himself fielding calls from national outlets, forced to speak carefully to avoid prejudicing the case. Irene Walker and her associates erupted with counterclaims, accusing him of slander, conspiracy, even calling him unhinged. Almost daily, new angles popped up: alleged hush money to certain officials, claims that documents were falsified, and attempts to block or delay. But the more they tried, the more evidence poured out. In the midst of this, Marcus's mother had a sharp decline. Panicked, he rushed to her side. She was on oxygen, her breath rattling. She tried to smile when she saw him, reaching a frail hand to pat his cheek. "You're so tired," she murmured, her own voice scarcely above a whisper. Tears welled in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom. This fight has gotten so big." She managed a tiny nod. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly, each syllable an effort. "Remember, the world changes because someone stands up." Her eyes drifted shut, and a nurse gently ushered him out to let her rest. As he walked away, shoulders bowed, he recalled a quote that Travis used to repeat: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Strange how the words from a generation ago still rang so loudly in the present. The final stretch of the hearing approached like a storm front, dark and volatile. Both sides prepared for a showdown. In the hush of a Monday morning, the courtroom overflowed with spectators. News cameras lined the halls, though restricted from filming inside. Judge Rathburn took her seat. She reminded everyone that the case had ballooned to reflect not only one instance of denial, but a systemic pattern. Foreman presented the whistleblower files in painstaking detail. She read emails that laid out financial incentives for turning away high-risk, low-cover patients. She showed spreadsheets where potential losses were weighed against possible media fallout. Gasps broke the stillness. Some audience members quietly wept, presumably people who recognized the insidious pattern from personal tragedy. Irene Walker, though obviously cornered, still fought tooth and nail. She threw technical challenges, insisted the documents were stolen property. She leveled an icy glare at Marcus. "My client can't be held responsible for the actions of a few rogue administrators. These emails are contextually incomplete and misleading," she snapped. "This is a smear campaign, Your Honor, nothing more." A subtle hush followed. Then Foreman dropped a final bombshell. A recorded conference call among Broadwell executives. Their voices calmly discussed how to handle patients who weren't worth the financial risk. The hush erupted into a wave of horrified whispers. Marcus, sitting to one side, felt a tremor in his bones, half revulsion, half triumph. Here was the proof that might end the systematic neglect. When the recording finished, Irene's face was drained of color. Even the judge looked stricken, as though confronted with the darkest aspects of human greed. Everything hung on the judge's final decision, which she postponed until after a recess. For an excruciating hour, the courtroom emptied, leaving Marcus pacing the hallway. The hush around him felt like the calm before a final thunderclap. He tried to remain calm. The entire case could still unravel if the judge decided it was beyond the scope. The swirl of federal and state agencies might overshadow the original lawsuit, burying it in red tape. Or maybe Broadwell would find a last-second technical out. He felt weak at the knees, the tension nearly unbearable. When the judge returned to the bench, the hush in the room was absolute. Marcus felt every second stretch like taffy. Judge Rathburn's voice echoed, "After thorough review of the evidence and in consideration of the public interest, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The documented pattern of wrongful denials, discrimination based on coverage, and deliberate obfuscation is undeniable. This matter will now move to the penalties phase, in coordination with federal and state investigations." A moment's stunned silence hung in the air, quickly followed by an explosion of noise, applause, sobs, excited chattering from reporters. Marcus sagged against the podium, tears stinging his eyes. He couldn't believe it. They had done it, or at least taken the crucial first step. People's lives might finally be saved. The bastion of corporate might had been cracked. Judge Rathburn rapped her gavel. "I want to emphasize," she said over the din, "this verdict is a milestone, not a conclusion. The system, as we've seen, requires sweeping reform. I expect continued scrutiny from federal and state entities." Marcus left the courthouse that day, swarmed by cameras, microphones thrust at him from every angle. He didn't have fancy words or a triumphant grin. His relief mingled with exhaustion. Standing on the courthouse steps, he uttered only, "No one should have to beg for care that could save their life. This victory is for every person who was turned away." Thunderous claps followed, but Marcus was already hurrying inside to call the nursing home. He had to share the news with his mother. His voice shook as he told her, "We won, Mom, at least for now." She was weak, lying in bed, but her eyes glistened with tears of joy. "I never doubted you," she whispered, her voice like a fragile wind chime. "So many people will be helped." In the days that followed, the story went national. Broadwell's stock plummeted as top executives resigned or were placed on leave pending criminal charges. Several states launched reviews of their hospital systems. Whistleblowers, emboldened by Marcus's public fight, came forward from all corners exposing dark truths about how healthcare was manipulated for profit. Lakewood itself was thrust into the spotlight, a humble town that had become ground zero for a revolution in medical accountability. Even so, the war was far from over. The penalty phase of the lawsuit would drag on. Federal prosecutors might pursue charges. Civil suits from families across the country piled up. But the machine had finally slowed enough to give people a chance at real care. Marcus's mother was fast-tracked for the procedure she had been denied. Though her health was fragile, doctors were hopeful she could see marked improvement. For Marcus, that alone was worth every sleepless night, every threat, every pang of fear. On a late afternoon soon after, Marcus found himself sitting on his modest porch, watching the sun dip behind the horizon. The sky was awash in fiery oranges and soft pinks. Travis came by, settling down in a creaky old chair next to him, while a cicada droned somewhere nearby. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Travis said, "You changed more than you realize, kiddo." Marcus, feeling those words seep into his heart, pressed his lips together. "I just did what was necessary." Travis's eyes shone with pride. "Exactly. Few of us actually do that. Our generation has a saying, the harder the battle, the sweeter the victory. And you've tasted that now, haven't you?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "I have, but there's so much more to fix." Travis patted his shoulder. "One step at a time. You lit a spark, and sometimes that's all the world needs to shift direction." Over the following weeks, interviews and discussions about healthcare reform flooded the airwaves. Some voices cynically predicted corporate interests would just rebrand and push new policies that skirted the law. Others believed genuine reform was possible. Middle-aged Americans especially resonated with Marcus's story, someone in their own age bracket who'd shown it wasn't too late to stand up and make a difference. A nurse from another state wrote an op-ed praising him as an ordinary man who showed extraordinary courage. The piece ended with a quote, "We can't help everyone, but everyone can help someone." Still, the changes came slowly. Court orders mandated that Broadwell revise its admission and billing practices under strict oversight. The AG's office declared that if further corruption was discovered, they would not hesitate to file criminal charges. Meanwhile, hospital staffers were trained to handle admissions fairly, even for patients with minimal insurance. Some longtime employees wept at these sessions, relieved that at last the tyranny of hidden quotas might be undone. Daniela, the brave nurse, was reinstated and even promoted. She gave Marcus a tearful hug one morning outside the old diner where the pair had first exchanged information. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I was so scared, but it feels like I can breathe again." Marcus's mother completed her surgery. It was not a miraculous cure. She still needed rehabilitation. But her color improved, her spirit lightened. The day she was discharged, Marcus wheeled her to the car, tears shining in both their eyes. The local newspaper was there snapping photos, capturing the image of the woman who symbolized so many others who had nearly been lost to bureaucratic greed. Orman, from the Department of Health and Human Services, confided that they had enough evidence to hold multiple top executives accountable. A new generation of leadership would be installed. "You made this happen," she told Marcus, swirling her coffee in a paper cup during a final meeting at the diner. "Don't ever forget that." He simply shrugged. "I just refused to be silent." She gave him a half smile, and that made all the difference. Late one evening, as the summer heat lifted and a cool breeze swept the small town, Marcus found himself alone in the living room, the same place he once dreaded phone calls. He turned on a soft lamp and stared at a picture of his mother in her younger days, full of vitality. Tears filled his eyes as he thought about how far they'd come and how precarious the journey had been. But at least now others wouldn't suffer in the shadows, like she nearly had. Memories flooded him of the darkest nights, receiving threats, thinking about giving up. He almost laughed at how naive he'd been at first, believing he could handle it all single-handedly. In hindsight, it was the collective push. whistleblowers, journalists, government agents, concerned citizens, that truly toppled the Goliath. He simply lit the match, as if echoing Travis's earlier remark. An old saying drifted through his thoughts. One man with courage makes a majority. In the months that followed, the lawsuit's penalty phase concluded with a substantial judgment against Broadwell. The sum was staggering, earmarked in large part for victim compensation and establishing a new public fund to assist those who were once denied care. The leadership vacuum at Broadwell led to new, reform-minded administrators. Coverage guidelines were scrutinized, while lawmakers began drafting legislation that would hopefully curb such systemic abuses in the future. Observers called it a watershed moment in healthcare oversight. At a quiet victory gathering one afternoon, Travis raised a glass of lemonade in a toast. "To Marcus," he said, "a man who reminded us that moral courage has no age limit and no job description." Marcus blushed under the attention but smiled. A small crowd of supporters, neighbors, nurses, local journalists cheered. Some repeated old quotes. "The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now." He forced back tears, overwhelmed by the knowledge that they had done something meaningful. His mother, seated nearby, watched him with pride shining in her eyes, a slight smile gracing her lined face. She was still fragile, but Marcus could see hope in her expression that had been absent for too long. That evening he finally allowed himself to rest. He sat on that same porch, gazing at the stars overhead. The night sky sparkled with a clarity that Lakewood seldom saw. Quietly he reflected on the entire journey. He remembered the moment he was told, "You can't do this," the countless times law firms turned him away, the fear that overshadowed his days when the intimidation started. He recalled the unstoppable avalanche once the truth began to emerge, the hush that fell every time new evidence broke in court, the gasps and tears from people who recognized they weren't alone. He whispered into the darkness, half prayer, half statement, "We did it, Mom. We all did it." From behind him, the screen door creaked and Travis stepped out. "Still awake?" Marcus smiled, looking up at the vastness of the sky, "Just thinking about how everything changed. I feel like a different person, and the world around me feels different too." Travis settled beside him, the old wood groaning under his weight. "You fought for what was right. When you reach the end of your rope, tie a knot in it and hang on, as FDR once said." A gentle laugh escaped Marcus. "Hanging on is exactly what I did." They lapsed into a comfortable silence, each lost in private thoughts. At last, Travis patted Marcus's shoulder. "Don't stop now. There's more to be done. You've proven that one determined soul can shift the tide of injustice." Marcus closed his eyes, letting the warmth of that statement diffuse through him. For the first time in months, he felt the tension in his chest begin to thaw. He heard the hum of cicadas and the quiet hush of a late summer wind rustling the old oak tree in the yard. And he felt hope, real tangible hope for the future. In the following weeks, more families came forward. Journalists asked Marcus to speak at public forums. Martin, his old lawyer friend, joked that maybe Marcus should go to law school. He politely declined, though he did begin volunteering with a local advocacy group for medical transparency. His quiet life as an accountant had transformed into something more public, but he recognized the necessity. There were still so many individuals out there, fearful and voiceless, who needed help navigating an unfair system. Even as the legal dust settled, he recognized that the seeds of further reform had only just been planted. Meanwhile, Broadwell's name was splashed across headlines, tarnished by damning testimony and crippling legal settlements. Their newly installed leadership team scrambled to rebuild trust, publicly committing to a new era of patient-first care. Some remained cynical, believing the corporate mindset could never truly change. Others felt progress was progress, no matter the impetus. Whenever cynicism gnawed at Marcus, he'd think of Daniela, the nurse who'd nearly lost her job to do what was right. He'd think of Althea, trembling in the streetlight with documents that proved the smear campaign. He'd think of Robert Cheng's unwavering coverage, or of Foreman's dogged commitment, or the legion of families who came forward, each letter, each story shining a spotlight on the inhuman policies. And in each case the pattern was the same: ordinary individuals summoning extraordinary courage. If so many could stand up, then surely the behemoth could be brought to heel. He'd lived that truth. Not long after everything cooled down, the same judge, Lynn Rathburn, invited Marcus to speak at a legal forum about citizen involvement in shaping public policy. At first, the notion petrified him. He was not a polished speaker, nor did he crave the spotlight. But Travis goaded him. Think of how many lives you could inspire. And so he reluctantly agreed, stepping on stage before a group of lawyers, judges, and community leaders. His voice trembled at first, but then he found his stride, speaking from the heart. I never saw myself as a hero, he told them, scanning the attentive faces. I was just a man who saw his mother's life slipping away, blocked by a system that valued profit over humanity. I was scared every day. I had no law degree, no big firm behind me. All I had was the truth, and I clung to it, because sometimes that's all it takes to make a crack in the wall, and once there's a crack, the entire structure can come down. Applause thundered through the hall. One older gentleman in the front row, his hair white as snow, stood up, tears glistening in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for reminding us that we can still believe in justice." The moment sent shivers through Marcus. In that standing ovation, he saw a reflection of all the people who had soared or suffered in similar battles, most of whose names would never reach headlines, and he realized that in some fundamental way he had changed, grown, and discovered an untapped resolve inside himself. He returned to Lakewood afterwards, content to slip back into something resembling normal life. His mother's health stabilized, enough that she could walk short distances with a cane. He resumed some accounting work. His old clients welcomed him back, albeit with a new sense of awe. People recognized him on the street, thanked him, sometimes offered to buy him dinner. To his surprise, the constant swirl of attention mellowed into a gentle admiration. Occasionally, new cases of corporate misconduct surfaced in the news, and Marcus would feel a pang of responsibility. He'd quietly remind people that they had the power to stand up. Meanwhile, the settlement money from the lawsuit's victory was distributed among countless families who had been cheated. Some used it for overdue medical treatments, others to pick up the pieces of their lives. More than the funds, though, was the knowledge that they hadn't been abandoned to bureaucratic cruelty. A sense of peace began to settle over the region, but no one doubted that the fight for a fair healthcare system would continue. The human capacity for greed and corruption doesn't vanish overnight. Yet maybe, with each victory like Marcus's, the line shifts a little further toward genuine compassion. Late one afternoon, as the sky glowed orange with the setting sun, Marcus took his mother for a gentle walk around the block. She paused often, leaning on his arm for support, but her eyes sparkled. "I can breathe, darling," she said, inhaling slowly. "I can breathe. That's enough for me now." Marcus smiled, guiding her onward. "And how about a celebratory glass of lemonade when we get back?" She laughed softly. "That sounds wonderful." Two neighbors waved as they passed, calling out greetings and praising them both. No cameras lurked, no reporters pestered them. It was just an ordinary day in a modest little town, but the air felt distinctly lighter. Every step Marcus took reminded him of the transformations that began with a single decision to fight back. He murmured an old phrase he'd once read: "The price of inaction is far greater than the cost of making a mistake." He glanced at his mother. She smiled, resting her head momentarily on his shoulder. "I've never been prouder of you, you know," she said. "Not because you won, but because you tried." His throat clenched, emotion surging. "I love you," he whispered, his voice thick. They continued ambling down the sidewalk, evening shadows stretching across the pavement. The warmth in Marcus's chest refused to dim. Though the lawsuit had concluded, the reverberations would echo for years, maybe decades. Those who once sneered at him in the courtroom had retreated or been silenced by the undeniable truth. Justice, imperfect but real, had triumphed in this round, and he had no illusions about the battles that lay beyond the horizon, for others or even for him again someday. But the lesson was etched into his soul. A single person's courage can spark countless others to stand up too. In the quiet hush after dinner, Marcus settled alone with a notebook in his lap. On a fresh page he wrote a few lines, collecting the lessons he had gleaned in that dramatic chapter of life. He hoped to share them with future generations, or maybe just to remind himself whenever doubt crept in. First, we must never underestimate our power. Even the most ordinary among us can face institutions if we believe deeply enough and gather allies. Second, fear is natural, but it's not an excuse for apathy. Every phone call or threat that tried to shake me only revealed the truth. They feared the truth themselves. Third, human lives must stand above profit margins. If we lose sight of that, we lose our humanity. Fourth, help can come from unexpected places. A nurse with integrity, a worried PR assistant, a local journalist who listens. Finally, as a great mind once said, "It is never too late to be what you might have been." I was middle-aged, set in my ways, comfortable in a career, but that didn't stop me from learning the law, from challenging corruption. We only fail when we decide to do nothing. He leaned back, reading over the page. It felt good to distill those thoughts. A twinge of sadness came as he recalled the many people who had suffered before the scandal came to light, but at least now the tide was turning. He carefully tore out the page, folded it, and placed it into an envelope to give to Travis someday, or maybe to Martin or to some stranger who'd need it. Because yes, the world changes because someone stands up. Out the moon was high, casting pale light through the window. Marcus gazed at it, letting the hush envelop him. He recalled quotes older folks often repeated, the kind that took on new resonance after what he'd been through. Strength does not come from physical capacity, it comes from an indomitable will. Over the last months he had discovered that will in himself, and it was a precious, humbling gift. He closed his eyes. The distant hum of a lone car passing by lulled him. Tomorrow he would begin drafting a new approach to help others navigate medical coverage. Maybe it would become a guidebook, maybe just a pamphlet. People needed to know their rights, to realize they didn't have to accept cruelty or disregard. That was how institutions changed, through knowledge and the willingness to act on it. Finally, with a soft sigh, Marcus allowed the day's exhaustion to flow out of him. His mind wandered over the entire saga, the tension in the courtroom, the bristling exchange with Irene Walker, the hush that fell with each leak of documents, the triumphant swirl of the final verdict. He found himself unexpectedly grateful for every twist and turn, every daunting challenge, for it had brought him here, to a deeper understanding of justice and a steadfast commitment to see it done. He murmured a final phrase, half lost in the quiet air, something that had carried him through the darkest nights. Truth and love must prevail over lies and hate. In that reflection, he found the anchor that held him steady. And so it was that the story of Marcus Davis, a middle-aged accountant who refused to yield, became both a cautionary tale for powerful institutions and an enduring legend for people who believed that compassion should never be for sale. The impact of his stance rippled onward, inspiring new legislation, encouraging more whistleblowers, and shaping the hearts of those who once believed they had no power to change the world. Through it all, the simplest lessons shone the brightest. When ordinary individuals unite in courage and principle, the once impossible can become reality. He would tell that story again and again to anyone who listened. He would remind them that we all walk a fine line between complacency and the call to action, and that crossing that line sometimes changes the world. To him, the greatest victory wasn't a line in a legal ledger or a sum in a settlement. It was the promise that no one, no matter their age, background, or social standing, need feel powerless in the face of injustice. Long after the legal dust settled, whenever he wheeled his mother around the block or spoke to local gatherings, people would ask him to share the deeper wisdom he'd gained. He often repeated variations of a single resonant idea. We might be a small voice alone, but when that voice rings out for the right reason, it becomes a chorus no one can ignore. He believed it as deeply as he believed in the sunrise each morning. And so, dear reader, if you find yourself in the quiet of your own home, questioning whether you too can stand up against something monstrous, remember the lessons learned in that unassuming little town. Because sometimes all it takes is one determined person to reveal that the fortress of injustice has cracks. Sometimes those cracks become openings and the unstoppable flood of truth pours in. In the words favored by many who reach their middle years with wonder still in their eyes, age is no barrier, it's a limitation we place on our minds. Let that be your guiding star, if ever you find yourself drawn to fight a battle you never imagined. In the end, Marcus's story offers us a set of timeless lessons that courage isn't measured by youth or physical prowess, but by an unyielding conviction in what is right, that unity among ordinary people can reshape entire systems, and that even the darkest corners can be illuminated if we dare to shine a light. And so, if you feel a stirring in your heart to challenge what seems unchangeable, listen to that inner call, for as another favorite quote goes, it always seems impossible until it's done. Lessons. Every person, no matter their age or circumstance, carries within them the seed of bravery, just as Marcus discovered that seed flourishes when watered by a sense of higher purpose. In standing against giants, the greatest ally is truth. Documents, stories, testimonies, all can converge into an unstoppable force that tears away layers of deceit. Fear is natural, but it is also the gatekeeper to transformation. Crossing its threshold often leads to extraordinary outcomes. Allies and helpers appear when you're on the right path. Their courage may be hidden at first, but it often emerges at the crucial moment. Real change is rarely swift or simple. Persistence, even in the face of personal threats, underscores the sincerity of one's mission. The greatest impact often begins with one small decision. Whether it's filing a single lawsuit or sharing a single document, the spark can ignite an entire movement. And finally, love, be it for a parent, a child, or humanity at large, is the deepest wellspring of unwavering determination. As middle-aged hearts often know, love fuels resolve in ways ambition or greed never can. Let these words remind you that while the road to justice can be riddled with obstacles, it is a path worth walking. As the saying goes, we do not see things as they are, we see them as we are. Choose to see with eyes of perseverance and hope, and you too may glimpse a better world on the horizon.